12. Twin Surprises. At the start of 1957, Elvis found himself in a constant grip of anxiety. The Colonel had lined up a plethora of creative and career opportunities for him, a third Ed Sullivan Show appearance, and 2 movies scheduled just for that year alone. But Elvis's personal life lay in shards. June would barely take his calls. Dottie considered her visit to be a disaster. Elvis was late coming to get her. Girls held up banners at the airport that said, "Go home, Dottie Harmony," and the Presleys read this big gold Bible every single night. And Barbara was upset about, well, maybe a lot of things. She obviously hadn't liked her shaver, but then that's what Dottie got her, going down the list of female gifts that Gladys gave them when they went shopping. Elvis had never meant the gift to be cold. In fact, he had extended himself for her with Hal Cantor on Audubon Drive. Knowing that Barbara had an interest in acting, and building on the conceit that the film was essentially his own story, Elvis had asked the director if Barbara might play his girlfriend. He wanted them to meet, he told Hal, and thought she would be good in the part. But Cantor thought otherwise, telling Elvis she was lovely to look at but horrible to hear. He said I had the worst voice he had ever heard, Barbara reports. I just assumed the Colonel, who was very rude to me, did not want me around, that the thought of me working with his boy every day curdled his blood. But it was very sweet and naive of Elvis to see if it could be done. To make it up to her, Elvis would wear Barbara's gold lame vest with one of Natalie's shirts on the Ed Sullivan Show on January 6th. He hadn't prepared her for it, so it was a wonderful surprise. I said, there he is on Ed Sullivan, coast-to-coast television, and he's got on my little $5 vest. I just loved it. At the network's request, Elvis sang a gospel number, Peace in the Valley, along with a version of Don't Be Cruel that was heavily influenced by rhythm and blues great Jackie Wilson, whose live show Elvis watched obsessively in Las Vegas. On the latter, the cameras cropped Elvis from the waist up, a brilliant tactical move on the part of the Colonel and Hank Saperstein, Elvis's merchandising king, to capitalize on his image as a sexual terror. At the end of the program, watched by 54 million Americans, the stone-faced Sullivan took time to deliver a character reference. "This is a real, decent, fine boy. We want to say that we've never had a pleasanter experience with a big name than we've had with you." Elvis knew he was the luckiest guy in the world, but he couldn't really enjoy most of the good things that were happening because there was so much weighing on him now. On January 4th, he'd taken his pre-induction physical to determine his draft status, and 4 days later, on his 22nd birthday, the Memphis Draft Board announced his classification, 1A. As the Colonel explained it to him, it meant he'd probably be drafted within the next 8 months. What Elvis didn't know was that his imminent service was precisely what the wily manager wanted, in part to morph Elvis's image from dangerous hooligan to all-American boy, hence Ed Sullivan's ringing endorsement. Elvis spent his birthday at home with his parents. He didn't feel much like celebrating, and he was leaving in 2 days to start work on the soundtrack for Loving You. One afternoon, he dropped by to see Dixie Locke, who'd recently married. Her last name was Emmons now. He and Dixie had so much history together that they could finish each other's sentences, but now that she seemed so settled and happy, he sometimes felt worse after he saw her. Emptiness was a terrible thing, a big blue ball that just swelled up inside you. He made a joke about his relationships years later. "I did Love Me Tender and Loving You, Loving Her, loving anybody I could get my hands on at the time. But the trouble with love was that the cards were just so stacked against you. How did married couples stay together for most of their lives? Better to just stick with girls who were so much younger that they didn't really expect anything of you." In fall 1956, Vernon went over to the local Oldsmobile dealership where the family often had their cars repaired and serviced. As he was leaving, the owner, a man named Mowell, asked if his 14-year-old daughter, Gloria, could meet Elvis. Vernon said that was fine, and for Gloria to come on over any time. On October 11th, Gloria showed up on Audubon Drive and nervously rang the doorbell. She was shocked to see Elvis answer the door himself. Gloria was cute, sweet, and personable, and she knew music. She'd identified Ruby Baby, a recent hit by the Drifters, who Elvis loved, playing on the phonograph in the den. After her visit, Elvis invited her back another day. Soon, she was taking her friends, Heidi Hyson and Frances Forbes, who were also 14, and Elvis began asking them over for evening swims at the house, or just to sit around and watch TV. Frances, a petite, dark-haired beauty, had been hanging out by the gate since she was 13. He didn't pay any attention to me then, but when I was 14, he noticed me. 14 was a magical age with Elvis. It really was. Fanatical in their devotion, the three girls followed him everywhere he went in Memphis. Elvis had an easy rapport with the trio and felt as if he could ask them what the other kids were saying about him and his music. They were his local contacts with a larger fan base, but it went deeper than that. He was fascinated with them, in the view of Lamar Fike, who was starting to integrate himself into Elvis's entourage. In no time, Elvis was inviting the girls to go to the Rainbow Rollerdrome, and by 1957 they became his constant companions. Part of the group that went to the fairgrounds to crash into one another in the Dodgem cars and eat endless Pronto pups. They also participated in other outings around town, all of which seemed designed to make up for the friendships and good times Elvis missed out on in high school. They were just as nutty as fruitcakes, but they were fun, Lamar remembers. He got irritated with them sometimes, but very seldom. All three of them were pretty cute girls. As Elvis's attraction to them grew, they started staying for private pajama parties. Just 14-year-old Heidi, Gloria, Frances, and their 22-year-old host holed up in his bedroom. When you were in that room, you wanted to shut out the whole world for the rest of your life, Gloria says. In an odd suspension of time and gender, Elvis became not only their age, but also a teenage girl. After their swims, he'd wash and dry their hair, and they'd blow his hair dry, too. He'd tease them, say to Gloria, "Frances was jealous tonight because I was throwing you in the pool." Then they'd all giggle, and he'd show them how to put makeup on their eyes the way he liked it, heavy on the shadow and mascara. It was sexy, he said, and sometimes he'd apply the eyeliner himself. Then they'd lie on the beds and roughhouse and have pillow fights, Elvis tickling and kissing them until they couldn't take it anymore. The girls insisted that nothing overtly sexual happened inside Elvis's pink lair, though it came close on occasion, as Gloria remembered. We'd tickle, fight, laugh, mess around, but all you'd have to say is stop, and he'd roll over and quit. It would never be mentioned again that night. But next time, it would be the same thing exactly. You'd fight with him, kid around, and scuffle. The next thing, he'd get serious, and you'd just push him away. I think that if he really pushed, I would have done it. No matter how Elvis defined his philosophy of rearing young girls, the relationship contained a strong erotic element and was reminiscent of the days when he invited several girls into his room at once on the hayride. Now Elvis and the girls would sit on the bed yoga-style, with Elvis in the middle, and he'd kiss each one. "Gloria is jealous 'cause I kissed Frances," he'd say, and then turn it around. "Frances is jealous 'cause I kissed Heidi." Eventually, they'd tire of it all, and Elvis would turn out the light, lying with an arm around two of them, with the third girl stretched out across his feet. Elvis was always kissing, says Frances, and it was a good kiss, a real good one. He might be doing anything, playing pool, anything. He'd walk up and kiss you, or he might turn his cheek for you to kiss him. He did that in the car a lot. He was especially romantic when it was just you and him. He might talk to you about things that bothered him, and just like teenagers, you'd neck a little bit. Elvis was like a teenager somewhat. The things we did were things that kids do. They really were all very innocent. A lot of people didn't think so, but it was a different day and time. Heidi, Gloria, and Frances were always the last fans to leave Audubon Drive. At 3 or 4 in the morning, Elvis would sit up and kiss each girl and say, "I love you, and I'll see you tomorrow." Lamar would drive them home, and they'd catch a few hours of sleep before getting up and going to junior high. "The amazing thing is that I never had one problem with any of the parents, not ever. It was something I assumed would not happen, and it didn't." Elvis didn't want his mother to know they'd stayed so late, and before Gladys got up, they were out and gone. But chances are she was well aware that they were there, and that she probably wouldn't have minded, given her approval of Jackie Rowland. She knew that Elvis, a boy man, was looking for a child woman he could mold into his idea of a perfect mate. 14-year-olds were just the right age, as they allowed him to play the role of the older man who would teach them about life. If he could find one who had his mother's coloring, who shared her values, and who also somehow felt like his twin soul, she would hold him captive. His friendship with the trio lasted through the early 1960s, about the time he met 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu. On January 14, 1957, Elvis reported to Paramount Studios in Los Angeles, where makeup supervisor Wally Westmore fulfilled one of the star's lifelong dreams, to have his hair professionally dyed black. The exact shade was mink brown, so dark brown as to appear black on camera. Aside from his stint in the Army, when he was forced to revert to his natural hair color, never again would he completely change it back. Though he'd inherited his hair color from his father, now he looked more like Gladys. It bolstered their bond, their oneness. Finally, Elvis also looked like Tony Curtis, whose work he still studied. He met his early idol one day on the Paramount lot. Curtis still remembers it. On lunch hour, I'd go for a walk. One day I went by this big camper, and the door opened and there was Elvis. He reached down and took my arm and said, "Mr. Curtis, won't you please come in for a minute? I've been a fan of yours ever since I was a kid. I want you to meet my buddies." He introduced me to them one by one, and he said, "What a joy, what an experience, Mr. Curtis, to finally meet you." I said, "Excuse me, please, don't call me Mr. Curtis. Call me Tony." He said, "Tony," and I said, "And what shall I call you?" He thought for a second, and he said, "Mr. Elvis Presley." In Elvis's view, the black hair was only one of several cosmetic improvements necessary to transform him to movie star perfection. He'd already had his teeth capped, but he'd always felt the bridge of his nose was too broad. With his darker skin tone, he thought it sometimes made him look negroid, and he wanted a more refined profile. Sometime between Love Me Tender and Loving You, he went to Hollywood's Dr. Maury Parks, a favorite among the film elite, to streamline his nose, sand away his acne, and tighten the skin around his jawline. Elvis would return to Dr. Parks in years to come, but at first he was skittish about any such procedure, and so he took George Klein with him, footing the bill for George's nose bob. Elvis had always liked Barbara Hearn's nose, so he brought along his favorite portrait of her and presented it to Dr. Parks as a model for George's new look. After the procedure, Elvis referred to George's proboscis as Barbara's nose. He might as well have used the Loving You ingenue Dolores Hart as an ideal, for the 17-year-old actress was the picture of fresh-faced innocence. Born in Chicago as Dolores Hicks, she spent her early years in Los Angeles. Her father, Bert, was an actor doing bit parts in films, and her uncle was the opera legend Mario Lanza, one of Elvis's favorite singers. Hart's parents divorced when she was small, but to escape their bickering, the child wrote a letter to her grandparents in the Windy City, asking if she might live with them. She arrived on the train, alone, with a ticket pinned to her coat. "From the age of 7, I never wanted to be anything but an actress," she says, in part to assuage her sudden mood swings. "I'm positive I'm somewhat manic-depressive by nature. I don't think there's anyone any happier than I am when I'm happy, or can take a nosedive quicker in the face of tragedy. I made a career of looking like an obvious neutral, rather than parading my feelings of being in the depths or at the heights." She learned her craft in one of Chicago's elegant movie palaces, where her grandfather worked as a projectionist. The child often went with him to work, awakening him from naps every 12 minutes so he could change the reels. Loving You, in which Hart plays Elvis's young love interest, was her first film. She won her contract after her remarkable lead performance in a Loyola Marymount University production of Joan of Lorraine led to an interview at Paramount. She arrived in her school sweater and bobby socks, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Within 2 weeks, she was on the set, but as a scholarship student who hit the books hard, she hadn't kept up with popular music and had no idea who Elvis was, really. He was just a charming, simple young boy with longer sideburns than most, but he had impeccable manners. When they were introduced, he couldn't have been more gracious. He jumped to his feet and said, "Good afternoon, Miss Dolores." Elvis found her the quintessential shy virgin. She was such a delicate girl, so untouched by worldly experience as to seem almost unreal. But it was obvious that she lived her religion, and as a devout Catholic, she insisted her favorite childhood memory was of her baptism at age 10. With Elvis, she made it clear right off the bat that she would not entertain the idea of mixing work with romance, because she didn't think it appropriate. Still, something in her responded to the primal beat of his music, and she found him both magnetic and thrilling. When he performed the musical numbers on the set, I couldn't take myself away from him. Even if I wasn't in the scene, I still went to hear him sing, because he was just riveting. You were just dragged away. Your soul just took you. He was so dynamic. When they kissed for the cameras, they both felt a connection. Dolores blushed way back to her neck, and my ears started getting purple, and even Elvis's ears turned red. Director Cantor called, "Cut," and the makeup crew rushed over, but Elvis and Dolores both laughed it off, knowing it would be a mistake for them to get involved. In an intriguing bit of casting, veteran actress Elizabeth Scott played something akin to a female version of Colonel Parker, except that as Deke's publicist/manager, her feelings for him bounced from maternal to vaguely erotic. Their brief romantic scenes carried a kind of androgynous magnetism. He too innocent and pretty, she too strong and dominant, even as they also telegraphed something taboo for the late 1950s. Today they remain compulsively watchable. Scott, born Emma Matzo in Scranton, Pennsylvania, was a pointed-brow blonde whose Slovakian features spoke of an underlying cruelty. Like Lauren Bacall before her, she exuded a delicious sensuality that managed to be both icy and fiery hot. Offset, she was as captivated with Elvis as Dolores Hart, but for a different reason. I've always thought that his eyes have been underplayed and his pelvis has been overplayed. The shadows around his eyes fascinated me, and I can't tell you why. They were powerful, piercing, playful, and sexy. But I wasn't aroused sexually. I just saw all these things in his eyes. Elvis was fairly certain that he hadn't aroused her, because 2 years earlier, Confidential magazine had outed her as a lesbian with a very busy little black book. The husky-voiced Scott, who never married, sued the publication, but it was an enormous scandal, and the public viewed her as a deviant. Hal Wallace, who had signed her in 1945 at age 22, kept her on the back burner for a while, but after Loving You, she disappeared from pictures for 15 years, resurfacing in 1972 with the quirky British film Pulp. Around that time, she spoke of her retirement, saying she'd never thought of it as such. I simply decided there was more to life than just making films. The most important thing to me is my personal life. Elizabeth tried to bond with Elvis, believing he was extremely intelligent, with a photographic memory, perhaps. But alas, you couldn't have an intimate conversation with him because of his entourage, and so she tried a different tack. Seeing that the guys played with water guns on the set, Elizabeth joined in. If anything, I had fun with him and his boyfriends because I had a water pistol too, so we water pistoled each other rather than verbalize. Yet Elvis was somewhat scared of her, as it was the first time he had knowingly been around such an exotic woman. The notion of her sexuality both titillated and confused him. He pronounced her unholy, especially since Junior teased him unmercifully. "Are you going to take her to bed tonight, Elvis?" Junior taunted, Cliff and Jean joining in raucous glee. "Don't worry," Elvis shot back nervously, trying to hide his discomfort. And he did invite her up to his suite at the Beverly Wilshire, but Elizabeth wanted no part of it. She was a sophisticated, smart lady, and she knew the guys had put him up to it. They weren't of the same metal that he was. He was just an entity unto himself. It was like the halo just went all around him. What can you say? That was Elvis. Deke's mascaraed eyelashes lent Elvis's character an air of gay desire. But no stories of homosexual dalliance or acting out ever surfaced about Elvis himself. In Hollywood, he invariably worked with actors, stagehands, and dancers who were gay, and when he had to be carried or lifted up overhead, occasionally one of them groped him. He didn't particularly like it, but it didn't spark his temper either. Mostly he chuckled. Still, Byron Raphael, the Colonel's young emissary in 1956 and 1957, remembered that when Elvis first went to Hollywood, he was totally unprepared for his visit with rock and roll queen Little Richard, whose songs, Tutti Frutti, Elvis had performed for several years. A fellow Southerner, born in Macon, Georgia, as Richard Wayne Penniman, Little Richard invited Elvis to his house after hearing that he had referred to him as a friend of mine, but I never met him, on stage in the spring of 1956. On the surface, they seemed to be interracial twins, both wearing mile-high pompadours and makeup, and both melding gospel and rhythm and blues into a new art form. Elvis was in complete awe of Little Richard, and Byron recalled that Elvis beamed when the piano-pumping sensation called the Colonel's office to say he was sending a limousine to bring the star out for a visit. Parker insisted that Byron accompany Elvis, who brought along Cliff and Jean. When they arrived, two beautifully coiffed women with lavender skin and dazzling jewelry opened the door, and then welcomed them with ceremonial grace. Moments later, Little Richard, wearing what could only be called a bright gold gown, as Byron put it, literally danced into the room. Elvis had never seen a black entertainer so wildly tricked out, not even in the seamier clubs of Beale Street, and his eyes got wide as saucers, Byron said. Their host had powdered his face a ghostly shade of white and accentuated his dress with diamond earrings, gold chains, a ring on every finger, and a wig that snaked 6 inches toward the heavens. Elvis and his friends stood there motionless as Little Richard rushed around the room, slapping at them playfully and fawning over Elvis and his talent. Elvis returned the compliment, and his new friend fluttered his false eyelashes. "Oh, shut up," Little Richard said, giggling, and then turned to Jean and Byron. "And you shut up, too." With that, the two musicians traded performances at the piano, and then it was over. On the way back, Elvis and Cliff guffawed and rolled their eyes, but Jean's face was fixed in a quizzical gaze, wondering why such gorgeous doorkeepers had such large Adam's apples. For a time, Elvis tried to integrate himself in the film community, even though Colonel Parker didn't want him mingling much. The Colonel preferred that he stay secluded at the Beverly Wilshire, both to give him an air of mystery and to keep him away from the influence of others, particularly stars who might suggest other representation. Elvis's fame was already such that he couldn't take a woman to dinner, but that also worked in his favor, helping ensure he wouldn't sleep alone that night. He simply invited girls to the party he held in his suite each evening. Such blanket invitations lessened the chance for personal rejection, but they also allowed for a more practical cover, meaning other members of his entourage could take the blame if Elvis got a girl pregnant. Byron believed that may have happened, as the Colonel had several important dinners with the parents of young girls who spent too much time with his client. After that, the Colonel had a directive. "When any girl comes up to Elvis's room, I want to make sure at least 2 of you guys are around. That way, if any problems come up, you can say, well, we made it with her too." Any woman who came up to see Elvis then, even a famous actress, would have to sit around with one of the other guys before she went in alone with Elvis. Elvis defied the Colonel at first, wanting to attend his share of Hollywood parties and see the town. One day he was riding a bicycle on the Paramount lot and stopped to meet Valerie Allen, a young starlet walking his way. "I want to take your picture, honey, with me on the bicycle," he said, and as Valerie found him the most handsome young man I think I've ever seen in my life, she invited him to a party at her studio apartment. But as soon as he came in the door, one of the guests said something derogatory about him, and wounded, he disappeared before Valerie could make her way over to him. Still, he saw her occasionally for the next year or so. She later became Mrs. Troy Donahue, but there were too many women after him for anything real to develop. Some of them, like B-movie queen Jean Carmen, weren't shy about one-night stands. Neither was Elvis, who was becoming increasingly hedonistic. Parker fretted about it, especially with the morals clause in Elvis's contract, and strictly forbade him to be photographed in situations that would give Paramount any reason to cut him loose. "I was at a party," remembered Carmen, a notorious bombshell. "I had this Indian costume on and not much else. Just a little thing going between the legs and no bra. Elvis walked in and went, hello. The photographer started shooting us, and all of a sudden his manager came along and pulled him away." Elvis intended to see the busty blonde anyway. She excited him on several levels. She was a former consort of mobster Johnny Roselli, and a pal of both Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe, whom she favored. Though she was 5 years his senior, he invited her over to the hotel. The first day I went to meet him, I was sitting in a chair, and he was sitting in another chair opposite me, playing the guitar. All of a sudden he strummed and said, "Are you wearing any panties?" That was his favorite thing to ask any girl, and of course I wasn't. Jean, an Arkansas girl who grew up picking cotton in Paragould, related to Elvis's simple tastes in food, and she had him to her place for dinner on occasion. I cooked Southern fried chicken for him just like his mother. He brought me a present one night, and I thought, oh, he's going to give me an outfit. I opened it up, and it turned out to be a little French apron. I put it on with nothing else, and everything was going great until I bent over to look to see if the chicken was done. Obviously, it burned that night. Elvis had his mother very much on his mind during the filming of Loving You, as at the end of January 1957, she was admitted to Baptist Hospital for tests. She stayed nearly 2 weeks, as doctors probed to find the cause of the abnormally dark circles around her eyes. They checked her liver, too, suspecting cirrhosis or hepatitis, since she admitted that she drank and used pills. But if the tests were conclusive, no one talked about them at the time. Barbara Hearn spent 2 days with her in the hospital. She did not look seriously ill, and silly as it seems, we had a very good time. I created some crazy hairdos for her, and filed and polished her nails, and we had something like a girl party in her room. For some reason, I was the only one with her for hours and hours each day. Her hospitalization delayed the Presleys' trip to Hollywood, but 4 days after her release, Gladys and Vernon, accompanied by their friends Willie and Carl Nichols — Carl was the contractor working on the house — took a night train for Los Angeles. Elvis gave them a tour of Beverly Hills and drove them past Deborah Paget's house as an excuse to try to see her. When they visited the set, they appeared as extras in the scene in which Elvis sings Loving You and Got a Lot of Living to Do in front of an audience. Elvis's parents can be plainly seen sitting on the aisle, Gladys still as full of rhythm as she'd been in her youth, clapping gaily to the beat. After her death, Elvis would never be able to watch the film again. Elizabeth Scott met the Presleys on the set, and she was struck by Elvis and Gladys's passionate bond. It was so obvious. You could not just see it, but feel it. Their synergy was nonverbal, but that tenderness went to full bloom when they looked at each other. Shortly after they returned to Memphis, Gladys and Vernon went searching for a new house, someplace bigger and more secluded. Their Audubon Drive neighbors, many of them society people, old money Southerners, considered the family an embarrassment and had worried them to death about the hordes of noisy fans who gathered at all hours and trampled the lawns. Elvis, hoping to make amends, accepted an invitation for cocktails from Frank and Betty Pigeon, who lived up the street. Frank had underwritten the insurance on the house, and the uncommonly beautiful Betty, a mix of Southern belle and femme fatale, was the daughter of E.H. Boss Crump, who ran the town from his election as mayor in 1910 until he died in 1954. At the last minute, Elvis, feeling awkward among the country club set, tried to back out, but Gladys insisted he go, and so he took Cliff with him and asked for Coke instead of bourbon. He was nervous until the Pigeons' 8-year-old daughter, Pallas, invited them to her bedroom to see her teddy bear collection. Elvis and Cliff went to meet the menagerie, and Elvis, who received hundreds of stuffed animals from his fans almost daily, promised to send the little girl a new teddy bear for her birthday, even though she never actually got it. However, one afternoon of pleasantry could not make up for the fact that the Presleys did not fit in on Audubon Drive. Soon, the neighbors bonded in a public discussion, offering to buy them out, and Elvis politely offered to buy them out. A nuisance suit was threatened. It was clear that the Presleys would be more comfortable elsewhere, and a chance meeting between Gladys and a young real estate agent named Virginia Grant outside of Lowenstein's department store led to the ideal place. In early March 1957, Elvis wrapped filming on Loving You, and on March 17th, the day he was to leave Hollywood by train, Virginia drove Gladys and Vernon to see a large home she thought might be suitable. But when the Presleys said they needed a bigger lot, the agent remembered an estate in the Whitehaven area, just before Highway 51 South eased into Mississippi. Called Graceland and built in 1939 for Dr. and Mrs. Thomas D. Moore, the property comprised about 14 acres of towering oaks and farmland, with the undulating grounds buffering the house from unwanted visitors. To the Presleys, who had never forgotten their sharecropping days in Mississippi, it must have seemed like Tara from Gone with the Wind. Vernon and Gladys called their son and excitedly told him about it, and Elvis was so eager to please them that without even seeing it, he told them they would have it. The Presleys gave Virginia a $1,000 deposit, and the deal, with an asking price of $90,000, was as good as done. On March 18th, en route home, Elvis sent a telegram to June Juanico, asking her to meet him in New Orleans during his brief layover there. They had barely kept in touch since Christmas, but in January he'd recorded Farron Young's Is It So Strange just for her. All the craziness of Hollywood had gotten him thinking about what was real and what wasn't, and he wanted to start over with her again, at Graceland. But June had a surprise for Elvis, too. She'd been dating a man named Fabian Taranto. His cousin, Salvador, played in the band Elvis replaced at the Slavonian Lodge the first time he played Biloxi. Fabian was a good man, and he needed her, unlike Elvis, she thought, and she'd convinced herself that he was the one. Earlier that month, Fabian had asked her to marry him, and June had said yes. Elvis had a big selection of women. Let him take his showgirls and shove 'em. Yet when she saw him, she couldn't bring herself to tell him right away. Now Elvis was standing in front of her and smiling so brightly that he almost glowed. He scooped her up and kissed her and then put her down, and he took her to a second train that had been waiting for his arrival. He climbed the steep steps and then pulled her up into his arms and carried her to his private car. There, he kissed her again. He wanted me to come to Memphis with him. He said, "Mama can't wait to see you, and I got a surprise for you. You're not going to believe what I bought for you. Wait until you see what it is." "What is it?" "I can't tell you. I'll have to show you. You gotta come home with me." June stammered and tried to clear the cotton from her throat. "But I didn't bring any clothes with me." "You don't need any clothes. You don't need anything. I'll buy you all new clothes when we get home." He was still holding her, but she shook her head and pulled away from him. "I can't go with you, Elvis. I can't." "Why not?" "I'm engaged to be married." His face fell and he stared at her in disbelief. Then he slumped down on the couch and held his head in his hands, not wanting to believe it was true. "You're kidding me, June. This is just to get even with me, right?" "No, Elvis, I'm not kidding. I'm serious." "Is that why you've been so cool to me on the phone?" "No, I haven't been cool to you. You've been busy doing your thing and I've been busy doing my thing. Your thing just gets in the paper. Mine doesn't." They sat there, both feeling sick, not saying anything. Finally, the conductor yelled, "All aboard!" and the train jerked to signal its departure. June was crying now, and she stood up and kissed him on the forehead. "I love you, Elvis Presley, and I always will." Then she was gone, running from the car and jumping down to the platform. She turned back to watch as the train began to move. She saw him leaning out the door, as if he wanted to hold her gaze before the train picked up steam and carried him out of her life for good. I can still see him hanging on to that train and waving goodbye. The train rounded the corner, and all I could see was his hand still waving. A few days later, the papers announced, "Elvis buys Graceland," and June realized what her surprise was to be. She married on June 1st, 1957, and 2 weeks later, Elvis phoned her mother to see if she were home. "No, Elvis, she's not here. Married life seems to be agreeing with her." And so he finally let it go. But June never did. More than 50 years later, no one has ever taken Elvis's place in my heart. I've just never been able to stop loving Elvis. 13. The Most Miserable Young Man. At 10 a.m. on Monday, March 19th, the day after Elvis arrived home, he drove out to Graceland with his parents, where they met with real estate agent Virginia Grant. Elvis looked around the house and grounds for a few minutes, and then baptized the home by playing some rock and roll at the piano. In high school, as Regis's prom date, all he had dreamed of was becoming successful enough to buy his mother a big brick home with a landscaped yard. Now, the 22-year-old had secured so grand a property as to befit a governor. All three Presley signed the sales contract as purchasers. Vernon first in bold, deep blue fountain pen, Elvis next in a different ink, and Gladys below in black ballpoint. By March 26th, the closing date, it was officially theirs, with a final price of $102,500, inflated by additional offers on the property as news of the deal leaked out. Elvis had sold the Audubon Drive house to a realty company for $55,000, paid $10,000 in cash, and taken out a 25-year mortgage for the balance of the six-figure purchase price. Vernon just prayed that Elvis's career lasted another couple of years. When the family got a new bedroom suite, and Elvis gave the old one to his aunt and uncle, his father furrowed his brow. "Son, I wish you wouldn't be giving all of our things away. We may have to put them on our back and walk out of here with them one day." Gladys had no idea how to update or furnish the 18-room colonial, and so, on the recommendation of Sam Phillips, who had just turned his ranch house into a modern, space-age showcase, the Presleys asked interior decorator George Golden to give them a bid. The enterprising Golden advertised his services with flatbed trucks that drove around Memphis showing off miniature rooms with the decorator's flamboyant touches. He knew that every decorator in town wanted that job so bad they could taste it. He arrived to find two female competitors, all over poor Gladys, waving sketches in her face and gabbing away like you wouldn't believe, he said. It was like a circus out there. Golden introduced himself and then stood back with Vernon. The decorator was married and knew a thing or two about women. He saw that Gladys was a shy countrywoman who had a real fear of being in closed-up spaces. As his competitors continued their locust-like siege, Golden began talking as country folk do, saying ain't and talking about decor. Finally, Gladys had had enough. She waved her hands in those women's faces and hollered, "Get away and leave me alone. Mr. Golden's gonna do our work." The family wouldn't move in for another 6 months, and they gave Golden free rein to decorate however he wanted. He livened Graceland's conservative rundown state with bright colors and a hodgepodge of styles, from Eisenhower-era suburban ranch to classic elegance. He also added dental molding to the cornices on the first floor and transformed the dining and living rooms with chandeliers, gold-on-white trim, and swagged draperies. At last, he suggested the Presleys erect a temporary fence and staff the perimeter with guards. Elvis picked out the famed music gates, which would be installed in April, but he wasn't home much for the renovation. He was busy preparing for a major tour and getting ready to shoot Jailhouse Rock, his first picture in a new deal with MGM, the following month. "When he was home, you knew it," Golden said. "Once he borrowed one of my delivery trucks and pulled a hat down real low over his face so he could drive through the gates without getting mobbed. Then, when he got back out of the truck, he took off the hat, bowed to the girls lined up against the fence and said, 'Thank you, ladies.' Well, they like to die." As Golden progressed with the property, Elvis proclaimed it the most beautiful house I've ever seen. He was so excited he needed to show it to somebody, so he dropped by to see Barbara Hearn. He said he was going out to look at Graceland, that he wanted me to be the first one to see it. Whether he said that because it sounded good or whether it was really true, I believed it. Barbara, who remembered how sparsely the family had lived on Alabama Street, was overwhelmed at how lovely and tasteful it was, but she found Gladys worn out with it all. Mr. Golden almost drove her crazy telephoning, asking her questions about every little thing. He just wanted to please her, but whenever I was there, she would have me answer the phone. She'd say, "If it's Mr. Golden, I'm not home." She cared, but she just wanted him to get on with it. By now, Barbara's romance with Elvis was over. They'd gone from friends to sweethearts to friends again. He was hardly ever in town, and when he was, their hours were just so different. He was up all night, and she was working or going to school. At the beginning, there had been only the two of them, and then Red, and then the Colonel. Now there was this entourage, and the guys would get jealous if anybody got in thick with Elvis. They didn't want anything to ruin their positions. And so it ended with a whimper. There wasn't any great breaking off, but I probably would have ended up walking away because I value loyalty and trustworthiness. In retrospect, she guesses the relationship hadn't really been a big love affair, or I would have been heartbroken when it was over, gnashing my teeth and wanting to slit my throat. And I wasn't. I just went on with life. Elvis did too. Sometime that year, he stopped in El Paso on a road trip home from Los Angeles. Impulsively, he called Deborah Paget and asked her to marry him. She told him it could never happen. "I know it's your mother and father," he said, "and if it takes 20 years, I'll get them to like me." I knew it was hopeless, she told biographer Suzanne Finstad years later. My parents would never relent. It was an impossible situation. The irony was that in a period of months, the most famous boy in America had lost all of his key romantic relationships. Gladys's sister, Lillian, had once noted that Gladys's unhappiness made Elvis melancholy too, even if they weren't together. So incredible was their communicative bond. But just when Elvis thought his mother should be ecstatic with her new showplace, Gladys complained to Lillian that she was cut off from everybody at Graceland. When Elvis was away, she'd say to Vernon, "I wish you could pray with me." And Vernon would respond, "I wish Elvis would come home." They were lonely, without much to say to each other, or even to Minnie May. And so not long after they moved in, Vernon invited his father, Jesse, and his wife, Vera, to come stay for a while, to drive down from Louisville in the new Ford Fairlane Elvis had bought them. The visit was awkward for Vera, with Minnie May in the house, but they all adjusted. Jessie was kind of overwhelmed at all of it, remembered Vera's granddaughter, Iris Sermon Leftwich. They weren't used to a king-size bed, and that night Vera sat on one side and Jessie on the other. He looked around the room and then back at his wife. "How's the weather over there?" he said. On March 27, 1957, Elvis left Memphis for Chicago with his cousin Gene, now Elvis's man Friday, Arthur Hooton, and George Klein, who was making his first trip with the group. Before starting Jailhouse Rock, he would do a brief tour of several U.S. cities with a quick swing into Canada. In a much publicized event, replete with press conference, Elvis would play the International Amphitheater the following night, debuting a $2,500 gold leaf tuxedo made for him by Nudie Cohen, the Russian-American tailor. Nudie was famous for elaborate and inventive stage costumes. It was Cohen who designed Hank Williams's famous white cowboy suit with musical notes on the sleeves, though he started out customizing underwear for showgirls and strippers at his first store, Nudie's for the Ladies, in New York City. Elvis had a particular stripper on his mind during his 2 days in Chicago, as he'd spotted an advertisement for Tura Santana's show at the Follies Theater. He was still as fascinated by exotic dancers as he had been in 1955 when he and Tura first met in Biloxi. His interest in them grew stronger during his trips to Las Vegas, and then again when he read the script for Jailhouse Rock. Now in Chicago, Elvis went to see Tura's afternoon performance, going by himself, wearing dark glasses and a hat. He watched her routine and then asked to go backstage. She hadn't expected him, so she hadn't made arrangements, and the girls from the show were just fawning and climbing all over him. Tura took him into her dressing room, but people wouldn't leave them alone, so they went to a restaurant down the street at State and Van Buren. The owner sat them in a booth in the back where nobody would see them, and they planned to meet again late that night at the theater. That's when we really started dating. Just as he had with 17-year-old Kay Wheeler, Elvis asked Tura to show him her dance steps. She explained that a lot of her performance was based on martial arts, particularly the flips and splits, and the knee slides and backbends. "What do you mean, martial arts?" he asked. "Well, my dad showed me how to protect myself after the rape. I incorporated a lot of it in my routine by just adding it to music." "Oh," he said, "you've got to teach me how to do that." She took him through it and then showed him how to do the shimmy with one leg, both legs, and then switch over. He laughed. It felt good. "Can you teach me how to twirl the tassels?" "Yes, but I can only teach you how to twirl one." He laughed again, thinking about where she might mean to put it. "What if I want to learn to twirl too?" "Sorry, honey, you really don't have enough up there to do that." "Okay, how do you do the knee slides?" "Carefully." He saw what she meant, and then she showed him how to do the slide and the splits at the same time. He'd been dropping to his knees on stage already for about a year, though he wouldn't be able to do it in the gold suit because the gold was already flaking off. But he wanted something a little more dramatic. The first time he tried the slides, he picked up a splinter, so he didn't do it again. He said, "That one hurt." Finally, he told her he wanted to learn the bump and grind, the big pelvic thrusts and the real hip swivel, not just the teases that he'd been doing since the Milton Berle show. Tura showed him some subtle movements, and he pushed her for more. He liked to do the bumps and grinds as I did them, and that was basically what he used in his routine from then on. Indeed, his 1957 concerts in support of the release of Jailhouse Rock, particularly his benefit show for the Elvis Presley Youth Center in Tupelo that fall, would be his most sexually blatant. He'd called her a time or two in 1956, and she claimed to have visited him when they were playing the same cities in the South. Now she became a sexual mentor for him as well. He might have been with a lot of girls, but he really had no technique as a lover. In some ways, their sex was clinical, and she sized him up in much the same way. He was not badly built. He wasn't humongous, but he wasn't tiny either. I would say that he was a little bit above average. He was always a considerate partner, always made sure she was satisfied. But in her experience, he kissed like a high school boy. I told him most women don't like to get their face that wet. And he was timid in the art of cunnilingus. He loved oral sex for himself. He wasn't very aggressive for the female, but he would try it if I wanted. I always cleaned him before and after, took him in the shower, or I would bring a nice scented washcloth with perfumed soap and wash him off and towel dry him, because I didn't want anybody else's residue. He once told me that I was one of the cleanest women he had ever been with. After years of separating sex and love, having good girls at home and whores, as he said, on the road, Elvis now tried to combine the two. But he knew that Gladys would never really approve of her, and Tura knew he couldn't be monogamous. You are only human, and you are a man, and that thing rules everything guys do. She also believed that he couldn't refuse women, that as a Southern gentleman, he literally didn't want to be discourteous to their advances. He wanted to please, and he didn't know how to be standoffish with women because that was not how he was raised. He always treated all women like ladies. But he seldom used protection when they made love, remembering the trauma of the early incident in Shreveport, and relied on early withdrawal as his form of birth control. Tura told him that had to stop. I said, "If you are going to be with other girls, make sure you are well protected, because somebody is going to try to say that she's gotten pregnant by you, and if you are not careful, she'll make you marry her or ruin your career." His mother had told him the same thing, he said. He'd be careful. The relationship, which was slight at best, lasted until he went into the Army. But though the romance faded, the friendship remained. Sonny West, Red's cousin, who would later join the entourage, remembers meeting her in the early 1960s. Mostly, Elvis would call Tura for advice with various women. "After we split and I was no longer his girlfriend," she says, "I became his adopted mama." Yet his fixation on burlesque stars, his female equivalent, continued. In October 1957, he went to Las Vegas for a 10-day vacation, staying at the Sahara Hotel. There, he had a one-night stand with legendary exotic dancer Tempest Storm, 8 years his senior. She later recounted it in a television interview. He called me about 3 one morning. He wanted to come over. I told him to come in the back door, that I didn't want the doorman seeing who I was entertaining. He crawled across a back fence, and in doing so ripped his pants. Storm excused herself to put on one of her sexiest negligées and to lock her French poodle in another room. The pooch would become a problem. All night, as Elvis and I were together, my little poodle barked and scratched at the door. The last time she saw Elvis was about 1970. The first thing he asked her was, "Do you still have that damned little poodle?" Elvis appeared to everyone to be on top of the world, thriving record career, movies, women, and now a mansion for himself and his family. But underneath, the stress was getting to him. That March in downtown Memphis, he was accused of pulling a gun on a 19-year-old Marine who claimed that Elvis had intentionally bumped into his wife. It turned out to be a Hollywood prop gun, and Elvis insisted he hadn't really meant any harm. Still, he sent the Marine, Private Herschel Nixon, a rambling 6-page telegram that offered both an apology and a window into his psychological state. "Many times there have been people who came up to me and stick out their hands to shake hands with me, and they hit me, and then take off for no reason at all. So when you called me over the other night, I didn't know what you were going to do." The following month, on April 19th, Elvis imported another Hollywood starlet to Memphis, this time for Easter weekend. Her name was Yvonne Lime. A California native, the wholesome blonde had an uncredited role in Loving You, but a co-starring role as Michael Landon's girlfriend in I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Elvis had seen her in The Rainmaker. Since he'd read portions of the script for his screen test, he studied the picture intently on its release. When Yvonne came on the Loving You set, playing a small part in which she talked to a group of teenagers, he stayed to watch her do her scene. It made her nervous, but not as much as when he came over afterward and asked for her phone number. The next day, he introduced her to his parents, who were still visiting, and to his friend Judy Spreckles. Then, after he came home to Memphis, he started calling her, saying, "Honey, I miss you so much. Please leave Hollywood and come." They stopped first on Audubon Drive, where Yvonne's picture now replaced Kay Wheeler's in his bedroom, and then he gave her a quick tour of town on his motorcycle. At the end, he rode her out to Graceland, which was still being renovated. They posed for a newspaper photographer, Bob Williams, in front of these stately columns. But Yvonne had on a striped outfit that looked more like California lounge pajamas than Tennessee streetwear. So the pictures telegraphed publicity, not passion. Then they went home. A couple of Elvis's buddies were there, including Jean, who acted goofy, carrying around a doorknob and a sandwich and a pair of pliers in a briefcase. For dinner, the Presley's new black maid, Alberta, served them all meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Elvis's favorite comfort food. After dinner, they sat out on the front walk in lawn chairs, and Elvis took Yvonne's hand. Then he picked up his mother's. "My 2 best girls," he said. He might as well have declared, "my past and my future." Except that Elvis could never really let go of Gladys. He could share himself with someone, and he needed that third person to mend the ancient circle, broken long ago in Tupelo, but he could never let there be just 2. It reminded Yvonne of their first date in Hollywood, when they'd gone to see James Dean's last movie, Giant, Elvis sitting between Gladys and Yvonne, holding his mother's hand with his right, and Yvonne's with his left. "Are you going to be my little girl?" he asked once Gladys had gone inside. "Yes, darling," she answered. But even then she realized it wouldn't happen. I knew from what Elvis told me that he couldn't think of marriage for a long, long time, and I was just beginning to get the picture breaks I'd worked for since I was a child. Most of all, life in Memphis was just too different from the way she'd grown up in Glendale. That Saturday, Elvis took her to an all-night party at Sam Phillips's house. She could tell Elvis hadn't been feeling well. He had a skin infection on his shoulder, he told her, that had been bothering him for some time. Even with all the noise and laughter, I could see Elvis was feeling worse by the minute. He was unusually quiet, and his eyes began to get a sick look. He excused himself to talk with Sam about it. Elvis came out with a rash just above his pubic hair, as Sam remembered it. It was just what we call a nice, big ol' risin'. The doctor will call it a carbuncle. He hadn't told anybody, and he ran around with that damn thing festering up for 2 months. We went into the living room, and he showed me. He said, "What can I do? You don't think I've got syphilis, do you?" It didn't look like it, but he was white as a sheet. I called Dr. Henry Moskowitz, my doctor, and I said, "Henry, Elvis is over here, and he's got a big ol' risin' on his stomach. Could you come and take a look at it?" And he said no, but he called down to Baptist Memorial Hospital, and he said, "You all run down there, and they'll take a look at it and let me know what they see." We went down to Baptist about 7 o'clock. When we first went in, there were 3 or 4 nurses there. I don't know what those sick folks did, because before we left, there were 50 nurses down there from every floor. Anyway, this thing was so red that when they lanced it, it shot 2 feet in the air. And you know how much pain he had to have been in for so long, but he was scared to find out what it really was. He hardly said a word on the way down there, and it was about a 10-mile trip. But on the way back, we couldn't shut him up, he was so happy. When they got back to the house, Elvis told Yvonne they'd given him some penicillin to help clear the infection, and he was feeling well enough to stay at the party. But by 2 a.m., he'd lapsed into a somber mood and began singing hymns and spirituals. It was raining by then, and Sam put some wood in the fireplace to cut the chill. It thrilled Yvonne to hear that famous voice in the darkened room, with just the light from the fireplace, and she saw he had more passion for religious music than any other. By daybreak, everybody was out by the swimming pool, laughing again and eating breakfast. Yvonne cooked Elvis's eggs for him, hard as a rock, the way he liked them. On Easter night, Elvis, with Yvonne and the entourage, went to services at the First Assembly of God. It was the first time he had been to church in a long time, and he felt both awkward and relieved. He passed a note to one of the ushers for Reverend Hamill, asking if the pastor would see him in his office afterward. He was sitting, waiting, when Reverend Hamill walked in. Elvis quickly rose. As the clergyman remembered, he said, "Pastor, I am the most miserable young man you've ever seen. I'm doing the things you taught me not to, and I'm not doing the things you said I should." He cried and asked me to pray for him. For more than an hour, the two prayed together, and Elvis continued to weep, asking the minister to forgive him for his sins. He didn't say what they were, and I didn't know what they were. But clearly Elvis was constantly in conflict with what he wanted to do and what he was doing. Reverend Hamill told him to call the next day, and he would give him the address of a pastor friend in Hollywood, M.O. Balliet. Elvis phoned Reverend Hamill's secretary on Tuesday morning, but he never followed through with the contact. The last time Kay Wheeler saw him, at the press premiere for Jailhouse Rock, she too could tell that Elvis was not himself. The change had set him. He seemed lonely and isolated, not the Memphis flash of the Texas tours of 1956. He walked in the room of probably 100 reporters and yelled loudly at me across the room, "Is that you, Kay?" Everybody turned to look at me, and I answered, "Yes, Elvis, it's me." Those were our last spoken words. But he remembered me. I was the one who got away. The plot of Jailhouse Rock, in which Elvis's character, Vince Everett, goes to prison for accidentally killing a man in a barroom fight, drew on 2 aspects of Elvis's life: his father's time at Parchman and his own fears of violence at the hands of others, as Elvis alluded to so fervently in his telegram to Private Nixon. The story, by Nedrick Young, who won an Academy Award for The Defiant Ones, follows Vince as he learns the guitar from a fellow prisoner, Mickey Shaughnessy, and becomes a hot new singing star with the help of record promoter Peggy Van Alden, played by Judy Tyler. Jailhouse Rock, shot in black and white, is memorable as the movie in which Elvis first hints at his abilities as a serious, dramatic actor. It also contains 2 scenes that would rank among the most unforgettable of his film career: the iconic cell block production number, Jailhouse Rock, which choreographer Alex Romero created from Elvis's natural stage movements, and his cocky love scene with Judy Tyler, which mirrored his brash behavior in his early days at the Louisiana hayride. When Vince impulsively grabs the tough but provocative Peggy to kiss her, a serious piece of manhandling, she pushes him away. "How dare you think such cheap tactics work with me?" she admonishes. "Them ain't tactics, honey," he drawls. "That's just the beast in me." The beast emerges in another famous image connected with Jailhouse Rock, a publicity photograph of Elvis in a nightclub scene with a blonde striptease dancer. In it, he sits at a bar in the background, gazing up at the stripper on stage, his image framed between her legs in the foreground. They spent almost all day lining up the shot, shooting it, reshooting it, and changing the marks, remembers the dancer, Gloria Paul. "He watched me so intensely every single moment of that scene. He never took his eyes off me. Even when we took a break, he kept watching me. I did a whole dance for him with bumps and grinds, and I told him, 'This reminds me of what you do.'" When Gloria first arrived on the set, Elvis thought she looked familiar. Then it hit him. She was the former showgirl whose fingers he'd sucked backstage in Vegas. He walked over to her for a playful reunion. "What are you doing here? Are you an extra?" Gloria teased. "I'm the star of the movie," he said. "You are? You flopped in Vegas and they made you a star?" He liked her cool banter and invited her up to the Beverly Wilshire for a party later that night. He had Suite 850, the presidential suite, he told her. It was 4,000 square feet of opulence, one whole wing of the hotel, 4 bedrooms, a living room with a fireplace, dining room, den, kitchen, library, and a butler's pantry. "I'd love to," she said, "but can I bring my husband?" It took him aback. "When did you get married?" "About a month ago." "Gee," he said, "I don't mess with married women." "Well, I'm sorry about that," she told him. "I don't mess around either." That was the end of that. But he invited me to lunch, and he held my hand all the way. He was very sweet and boyish. One night, Byron Raphael, the William Morris agent in training, took his new wife, Carolyn, to one of Elvis's parties at the hotel. She was hoping to become an actress, and Byron could tell that Elvis found her attractive. The next day, when Elvis and Byron were sitting in his MGM dressing room, the star said, "Your wife sure is a sweet one, Byron. That's the kind of girl I've been looking for. There must be hundreds of girls outside the gate. Why don't you see if you can find me another Carolyn? In fact, take care of business for me." From then on, Byron began supplying him with young girls, particularly his ideal type, a 5'4" brunette with pretty eyes and a round behind. To him, that was the most sensual part of a woman's body. As Elvis's pimp, Byron would make one bad choice in 2 years. On the road, after a concert, he procured a luscious girl who stood 5'10". He guided her into Elvis's room without warning him that she wasn't his usual cup of tea. Later that night, Elvis came out in his bathrobe and barked, "There was 10,000 girls out there and you picked the only one on stilts. Don't send any more Amazons in here." Though Elvis described his sexual appetites as voracious, he'd say, "I like it hot and heavy, Byron the Siren. Hot and heavy." Byron was surprised to find that Elvis was far more interested in heavy petting than doing the wild thing, especially with young virgins. One evening, he brought 3 young girls into Elvis's bedroom. Soon they were all naked, but Elvis stayed in his underwear, kissing and fondling them, and eventually falling asleep with them in his arms, his own records playing softly in the background. He would never put himself inside one of these girls. Within minutes, he'd be asleep, and often the girl would still be rubbing herself against him. I'd step in and say, "It's time to go now, honey. Elvis needs to sleep." Girls would come out in tears, crying that Elvis had told them to wait until their wedding night, or they'd get hysterical and whine that Elvis didn't love them. Byron learned damage control on the job. I'd say, "No, that's not true. He just wants to make sure you don't have a baby. He'll call you again." Of course, he almost never did, but with some of the younger ones, he'd be like the Tooth Fairy, slipping $100 bills in their school books. In May, Lamar Fike read in the paper that Elvis had aspirated a cap from one of his front teeth while sliding down the pole in the film's big production number, and that he was recuperating from surgery to remove it from his lung. For several months, Fike had been living in Texas and working as a DJ. His career was short-lived. He couldn't coordinate the turntables, check the teletype machine, read the barometer, and get the commercials in order at the same time. One day I just put an LP on, locked the doors, and got in the car. I heard the record going chick, chick, chick on my way out of town. That was my way of signing off. Now Lamar picked up the phone and called Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles. He asked for Elvis's room, and the operator patched him through. Elvis answered the phone himself. I told him about my little exit from the radio station, and he laughed and said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I didn't know," and he said, "Get your ass out here." Fueled on uppers, Lamar climbed in his new two-door 1956 Bel Air Chevy and drove 36 hours straight on Route 66 to Los Angeles. From then on, he was an official part of Elvis's entourage, and within a day, Elvis would get him work as an extra, along with Gene, Cliff, Jr., and George. At the Beverly Wilshire, Lamar was surprised to see Natalie Wood, whom he had met in Memphis on Audubon Drive. By now I knew that Natalie was a good person, but she wasn't very sure of herself, and you never knew what she was going to do. One day she got out on the window ledge at the hotel. She must have liked Elvis better than she did in Memphis, because she said she was going to commit suicide over him. I came running into Elvis and I said, "She's out on that thing, she's going to jump." He said, "She won't jump." I said, "I'm telling you, she's going to do it." She crouched out there about half an hour, promising, swearing she was going to jump. He finally talked her back in. He said, "Nat, come and sit down and quit being so dramatic." She came back in and I just collapsed in a chair. But Elvis was real nonchalant. He said, "I told you she wouldn't do it." As filming began, Elvis had a date with Ann Nayland, who had a credited but minor role in the picture. But as on his first two films, where he'd set the precedent, he quickly turned his attention to his co-star. Judy Tyler was a newlywed, having just married second husband Gregory Lafayette in March. Despite what the singer told Gloria Paul about not fooling around with married women, she and Elvis had a thing going, according to Lamar. At 23, Judy Tyler, real name Judith Hess, was a tough cookie and a show business veteran with a pedigree. Her father, Julian Hess, was well known as a trumpeter for Benny Goodman and Paul Whiteman, and her mother, Loreleo Kendler, danced with the Ziegfeld Follies. At 16, Judy had won a Miss Stardust beauty contest, which led to a job as a singer chorine at the Copacabana nightclub. In 1951, when she auditioned for, and won, the part of Princess Summerfall Winterspring on the Howdy Doody Show children's program, the irrepressibly sexy 17-year-old failed to mention that she was married to 26-year-old Colin Romoff, the Copa pianist and her vocal coach. She lasted 2 years as the grown-up puppet, but by then she had quite a reputation, drinking and stripping on nightclub tabletops. The consensus was that she was drop-dead beautiful, but she had a foul mouth, round heels with some of the cast and crew, and took no guff from anyone. In his book, Say Kids, What Time Is It?, Stephen Davis, whose father, Howard Davis, was the show's writer-director, recounts numerous stories of Judy's wild behavior and numerous romantic liaisons. She loved sex. She slept with everybody, lamented Chief Thunderthud's Bill LaCornick. Clarabelle was especially shocked. "I would go out on weekend appearances with her," said Bob Nicholson. "And while we got along fine, she would just as soon tell a store manager to go fuck himself as she would look at him. She had stars in her eyes and thought she was bigger than he was." And she was. In 1956, she earned a Tony nomination for her performance in the play Pipe Dream, which landed her on the cover of Life magazine. Jailhouse Rock was Judy's second film, and she appeared to be poised for a long career. But over the 4th of July weekend, with filming just finished in mid-June, She and her husband were killed in a car crash near Billy the Kid, Wyoming. One story said she'd been cut in half. Elvis was devastated. It really, really upset him, says Lamar. He broke down and cried, sitting up in the bathroom at Graceland. Nothing has hurt me as bad in my life, Elvis told the newspapers. I remember the last night I saw them. They were leaving on a trip. All of us boys really loved that girl. On July 4th, Elvis, clearly distraught, showed up at George Klein's house early in the morning. It was so awful about Judy. He'd just saved her from one serious accident when she'd run into a door, putting her arm through the glass. He'd managed to grab it, keeping her from falling through. Then, changing the subject, Elvis mentioned he'd been watching this tiny blonde, Anita Wood, the replacement for Susie Bancroft on Wink Martindale's WHBQ Top 10 dance party. George said he could get him an introduction. That was Thursday. On Monday night, Elvis had his first date with his next serious girlfriend. 14. Nipper Dreams. Anita Wood was 19 years old, wore her hair in an appealing blonde bob, and was in all ways a perfect Southern sweetheart. She had grown up in Jackson, Tennessee, where she developed a spunky personality, as well as a soft, lilting accent that rolled the R's off the end of her words. Teenager. It sounded cultured, though, so it didn't get in the way of her DJ work. And Anita was not only pretty and pert, with dimples at the ready, but she was also talented and poised. She'd cultivated her singing voice and knew how to perform on camera. She also had a strict code of ethics, which Elvis was soon to learn. Instead of calling her himself for their first date, he'd asked Lamar to do it that Saturday, after her dance party show. Elvis wanted to see her that night. "I'm sorry," she said. "I already have a date tonight." Lamar couldn't believe it. He went, as Anita remembers it, ballistic. But she'd given her word to Jimmy Omar for that night. "You mean you won't break a date to go with Elvis Presley? Are you crazy?" No, she wasn't crazy, but she also really wasn't an Elvis fan, though as a disc jockey she played his records, and she'd grown up with Cliff Cleaves. Well, I don't believe Elvis would like that if I did that to him. Anita thought she'd never hear from Elvis after that, but Lamar called again for Monday night, and this time she said yes. She wasn't sure what she was getting into, though. She'd grown up innocent and sheltered with stern parents, and since they wouldn't allow her to date, she'd never had a serious boyfriend. In the big city of Memphis, she rented a room from an older woman, Miss Patty, who clucked over her like a mother hen. When Elvis's sleek black 1957 Cadillac limousine pulled up at the house, George Klein got out and walked to the door. "I'm here to pick up Anita," he said. But Miss Patty pulled herself up in a self-righteous stance and refused him. "No, I'm sorry," she said. "If Elvis wants to see Anita, he'll have to come to the door and pick her up." George went back to the car and explained the situation, and then the two of them came up the walk. Elvis had on his red velvet shirt, black trousers, and a black motorcycle cap, and for a moment he stole Anita's breath. He was effervescent, absolutely the best-looking man I've ever seen, before or after. The protective Miss Patty led Anita's gentleman callers into the living room. There, she laid down the law. "Now, you have to have her back at a reasonable hour," she said. Otherwise, Anita couldn't go. Out in the car, Anita was surprised to find Lamar and Cliff, too, as she thought this was a date, the kind of thing where a boy and a girl go out together without other people. And where were they actually going? Elvis just seemed to be driving around. Then they pulled up by the Strand Theater, where Elvis showed her a giant cutout of himself as a display for Loving You, which was scheduled to premiere the following night. They drove around some more, stopping at a Crystal stand to get 3 dozen hamburgers. Anita didn't like the little square steamed sandwiches, and she was amazed to watch the guys wolf down every one. After that, Elvis asked if she'd like to see Graceland. I said, "Sure, I'd love to." I felt really at ease because of the guys in the back seat that I knew. As soon as they got in the door, Elvis gave her a pink and black teddy bear from a large supply in a box in the dining room. His double-sided single, Teddy Bear/Loving You, had just sold 1.25 million copies in a week, and the Colonel had bought a gross of stuffed animals from a wholesale carnival house. It was a pleasant evening. Elvis introduced her to his parents and grandmother, and then gave her a tour of the lower floors. Then the group listened to some music, and Elvis played the piano. Finally he said, "Come up, I want to show you my office." There wasn't much to see in his office, really, but it was right next to his bedroom, and he gently led her inside. She couldn't believe how dark it was, with navy blue drapes. Then she saw his bed. It was 10 by 10 feet and required specially made sheets, he told her. He had mirrors all around the room, too, and light blue mirrors in the bathroom that matched the baby blue carpet. They were just talking, finishing their tour, when Elvis began to sit her down and kiss her. She knew she was a small-town girl, but she was shocked. People didn't kiss on the first date then. She didn't care who he was, and she didn't like it, especially when his hands moved just a little bit where I didn't think they should have been. "I think I need to go home now," she said. He didn't put up a fuss. A couple of nights later, he invited her with his parents to see a private screening of Loving You, and then he came by one day in his old panel truck. He wanted to take her down to Lauderdale Courts to show her where he grew up, and then swing by Chenault's drive-in for hamburgers. After that, he saw her almost every night, even if it was just to go back to Graceland to watch TV. 5 days after that first date, Gladys invited Anita for dinner. She liked this girl, and she told Elvis not to let her get away. Elvis liked her too. He talked baby talk with her. "I just ate that up. He treated you like you were a doll." And because she stood only 5'3" and weighed 110 pounds, Elvis affectionately called her Little or Lil Bit. He referred to himself as the Thing. Within 2 months, he was serious about her. He took her home to Miss Patty's one night and lingered on the porch. "Little," he said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." A diamond and sapphire ring quickly followed, and before long, he'd give her a car, a 1957 Ford. At first, Anita wasn't sure if she was in love with him or not, mostly because they'd been alone only a few times, and even then not for very long. It gave her serious reservations about their future. They'd go off together on his motorcycle and sit at the big white piano in the music room and sing together for hours. But some of the guys, like Lamar, lived at Graceland, and Lamar even spent the night in Elvis's room sometimes to keep him from sleepwalking. The cousins were always around, too. Elvis and Jean had that weird little language that only they seemed to be able to decipher. They said ep skep 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 a lot, and little Billy was now 14, old enough to tag along places. When they'd go to the fairgrounds for crazed nights riding the Pippin, the rickety wooden roller coaster, or rent out the Rainbow Rollerdrome, or the Memphian Theater across town on South Cooper Street, he invited everybody who was at his home, and even the strangers standing around at the gate. He always invited his fans to go. They would all go to the fairgrounds, friends, family, and fans. Sometimes the group numbered as many as 200, and now Elvis had added another guy to the circle, Alan Fortas, a friend of George's through the local Jewish organizations. Alan, a big, overfed boy, was a year younger than Elvis, but Elvis already knew who he was. Alan had been an all-Memphis football star at Central High. Given his own mediocre showing on the field in high school, Elvis liked having Alan around. But most of all, he liked Alan because he was full of the devil. Soon, he'd given him a nickname, Hog Ears. Around the same time, Marty Lacker started coming out to Graceland. A New Yorker who'd moved to Memphis at 15 in 1952. He'd attended both Central and Hume's, so he already knew Alan and George and Red, and to some extent, Elvis. The first time he went out to visit, Elvis and Anita were just coming out of the barn. He, too, would eventually become a part of the group, as would 15-year-old Jerry Schilling, who Elvis first met in 1954 through Red West, playing football in Guthrie Park. Elvis would brag about Anita to the guys, and everything about her seemed to enchant him. He told his friends he was pretty sure she was a virgin, and he loved it when she showed off her figure. One day it was hot, and Anita suggested they go swimming. Lamar was there, and Elvis turned to Anita in her swimsuit. "Lamar, look at her. Just look at her. That hip is just a little bit bigger than the other hip. But other than that, she's just perfect. Turn around, little." Elvis was not alone in appreciating Anita's attributes. That summer, the Memphis Press Scimitar ran a photograph of half a dozen girls who would compete on August 22nd in the Mid-South Finals of the Hollywood Star Hunt, a beauty talent contest that the newspaper sponsored with the Strand Theater. Of the 6, Elvis had dated 3, Barbara Hearn, Anita, and Barbara Pittman. Both Anita and Barbara Pittman sang. 2 of the other women danced, and Barbara Hearn did a dramatic interpretation of George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, the climactic burning at the stake scene. Anita won and went on to the finals in New Orleans, where she captured the grand prize, a 7-year contract with ABPT, American Broadcasting Paramount Theaters, which also entailed work with Paramount's movies, television shows, and record label. Elvis told Anita, "The things that went on in California were the things that went on in hell." But Elvis was happy for her and pleased to see that Little was still her unaffected self. One morning about 6, they were coming home from the roller rink with Lamar and Alan. It had been a ferocious night. They'd played tag and roller derby and the rough game of knockdown, skating toward each other with all their might with only the winners left standing. And everybody was bruised and battered. Elvis whispered something to Anita in the back seat, but Alan, sitting next to Lamar in the front, couldn't make it out. Suddenly, Anita leaned forward. "Hey, y'all, my cunt hurts." "What?" Elvis wasn't sure he'd understood her. Surely she hadn't said what he thought she'd said. Lamar was driving and just sat frozen at the wheel. God, he thought, did I hear that? I have never. "Did y'all hear me? I said my cunt really hurts." Lamar almost ran off the road. He had to stop the car, and Alan doubled over. Elvis fell on the floor, choking now, barely able to catch his breath. "He had a Pepsi in his hand that just went up in the air all over the seat," Anita says, and they just died laughing. She didn't know why they were making such a big thing of it. Elvis had told her that now that she was going to Hollywood, she had to know the LA word for behind, and her rump was sore. "He loved to pull tricks. I was so embarrassed when I found out what I'd said. It's not that I was dumb. My family didn't talk ugly words, and I was just very naive." Anita was also ingenuous about Elvis's ability to be faithful. 2 weeks before the finals of the Hollywood Star Hunt, he had brought the British-born starlet Venetia Stevenson to Memphis. She had been divorced from Russ Tamblyn, Elvis's Hollywood acquaintance, only since Valentine's Day. He'd always come to me and say, "But Little, you know these are just publicity stunts. It doesn't mean anything. You're the only one I care anything about." For proof, he wrote her MASH notes. "I love you, love you, love you, you little." Anita wanted to think it was true, that even though he had his arms around all those starlets and showgirls, the latest was Vegas singer Kitty Dolan, it didn't really mean anything. And gullible me, Elvis could make you believe anything. She moved into Graceland in 1957 and lived upstairs. That got to be a hot and heavy affair, in Lamar's viewpoint. The guys weren't sure whether she actually slept with him. There were 2 other bedrooms on the 2nd floor, but they assumed not. Anita was too proper for sex before marriage, and Gladys wouldn't have liked it going on under her roof. Either way, says Marty Lacker, Elvis reverted to his usual ways when she was out of the house. One time Anita went out shopping, and Elvis brought another girl upstairs. He was fooling around with her in the bedroom when all of a sudden one of the guys called up and said, "Hey, Elvis, Anita's coming through the gate." If you looked out his window, it was a straight drop to the ground. So we put a ladder up to the window. He let the girl climb down first, and he waited about 5 minutes, and then he went down. Anita came in and went upstairs. And, of course, he wasn't there. He walked around the back of the house to the front and came upstairs behind her. He said, "Oh, you're home, great." He would do stuff like that all the time. When she found out about the other women, she was hurt and angry, but she rationalized it as the actions of a man in a unique situation. They were all available, and it was a great temptation, and he succumbed to it. And he was also her first love. Now she cared so much for him that when she went out to California for a movie role, she realized she didn't really want a career if it kept them apart. He called me on the phone. "Little, I miss you. I want you to come home." Well, I just said okay. He met me at the airport. Eventually, she would give up her whole career. It hadn't meant a lot to her anyway. Her parents had always wanted her to be an entertainer because God had given her a voice, and she did like to act and sing. But really and truly, I just wanted to get married and have children and be a normal person. Well, with Elvis, you could never be normal. I found that out right away. The Colonel, for example, insisted that she and Elvis stay at different hotels when she accompanied him to California. His fans would leave him if they thought he was in love, Parker argued. And so Elvis should just say that he and Anita were dating. The manager didn't even want them photographed together, or if they were, he said, Anita should look away from the camera, and from Elvis too. He certainly didn't want her looking happy. But there she was, right behind him, smiling like a newlywed backstage at the Tupelo Fair in late September. The Colonel chomped hard on his cigar, but nobody seemed to notice. They were talking about those big pelvic thrusts that Elvis did on stage. Wow, where did he learn to do that? On October 28, 1957, a who's who of show business celebrities were among the 9,000 in attendance on the first of Elvis's 2 nights at the Pan Pacific Auditorium in Los Angeles. That evening, Elvis not only gave the most incendiary performance of his career, but he also scandalized himself in a lascivious display that surpassed anything the majority of his audience had ever seen. Harnessing all his power as a sexual revolutionist, he went far beyond his inflammatory appearance on the Milton Berle show, and even his recent act at the Tupelo Fair. Byron Raphael had the best view of anyone, and in 2005, he wrote about it for Playboy magazine. The Colonel had put me on nipper control that night, which meant he positioned me beneath the stage and charged me with the safety of a 3-foot-high plaster of Paris canine, the infamous cocked ear Jack Russell mascot of RCA, Elvis's recording label. Elvis was going to use the pup as a prop during Hound Dog. "Whatever you do, don't let that dog fall off the stage," Parker snapped, "and tell Mr. Presley you're going to hold Nipper up so he doesn't have to worry. He can just be free." The Colonel often said, "Elvis has stardust," meaning that it was remarkable how such a shy person could change himself into a creature of infinite magnetism on stage. But the old hustler never dreamed what Elvis was planning to do with man's best friend. Elvis came out on stage with his now famous gold lame jacket, topping a pair of loose-fitting black dress slacks. During his 50-minute, 18-song set, he wiggled, bumped, and twisted, according to Jack O'Brien of the New York Journal-American, one of many out-of-town papers that covered the event. But it was the finish of Hound Dog that prompted another paper's headline: "Elvis Presley will have to clean up his show or go to jail." I don't know exactly what got into him, but as he launched into that song, he was vastly different from the Elvis I knew at the studio. His eyes were dilated, as if he were taking his direction from some place far, far away. Then he did the unthinkable. Pumped up by either adrenaline or libido, he began to unfasten his pants and slowly pull his zipper down, which prompted wild screaming from an audience that was already frenzied at the sexual surge Elvis sent out through the auditorium. With his pants now open, but not down, Elvis reached for Nipper, which I still held tight from below the stage. Suddenly, Elvis pressed the dog against his crotch, and I could feel him pushing it back on me as he rode the pooch back and forth in a masturbatory glide. As the crowd noise grew to a furious roar, Elvis continued to dry hump poor Nipper as if he were a teenage girl at a drive-in. Then, all of a sudden, Elvis pulled the dog out of my grip and then began rolling around on the floor with him in full simulation of bestial bliss. It was one of the most shockingly erotic things I'd ever seen. There's no question that Elvis was truly trying to have sex, because when he finally gave the dog back to me, I could see a huge hard-on through his pants. The next night, the LA Vice Squad came, armed with warnings, and the police filmed the show. But Elvis toned it down, and Nipper made it through without undue violation. When the Playboy article was published, Elvis aficionados challenged Raphael's account. Gordon Stoker of the Jordanaires, who performed with him that night, insists he saw nothing inappropriate in Elvis's actions. Elvis did not do anything on stage with Nipper that was suggestive or off-color. We were standing very close to him on stage, as we always were. We would have seen him. Photographs, however, show Elvis draped across the dog, and the New York Journal-American reported his performance was far too indecent to mention in every detail. He was on the floor, he put his arm around the dog lying flat next to it, and he had his leg around it, offers Kevin Eggers in explanation. That's what was happening. Now, in the context of what he was doing, it was outrageously provocative, but it wasn't Jim Morrison. Byron had made it clear that Elvis had not actually exposed himself, as the lead singer of The Doors was arrested for doing in an infamous 1969 incident in Miami. Still, Eggers says, Elvis Presley would never have pulled down his fly. But Eggers was not in the audience that night, and the Jordanaires did not have Byron's proximity from beneath the stage. Even if Byron embellished his story, or if his memory was faulty after nearly 50 years, others had the same interpretation of the singer's intent. Albert Goldman's 1981 controversial biography, Elvis, refers to adults leaving the theater with the idea that Elvis had capped an obscene performance by pretending to bugger the dog. Dick Williams, the entertainment editor of the Los Angeles Mirror-News, was clearly outraged at what he saw, calling Elvis a sexhibitionist and going on for a dozen paragraphs. If any further proof were needed that what Elvis offers is not basically music but a sex show, it was proved last night. The madness reached its peak at the finish with Hound Dog. Elvis writhed in complete abandon, hair hanging over his face. He got down on the floor with a huge replica of the RCA singing dog and made love to it as if it were a girl. Ricky Nelson, who met Elvis at a party in his hotel suite after the second night, never got over the performance, telling friends for years how Elvis group-fucked 10,000 people. Whatever happened on the first night, whether Elvis's eyes were dilated, as Raphael wrote, because he was taking pills, which might have affected his behavior, Elvis was far less flamboyant the following evening. When the police showed up with a movie camera, he poked fun at it all, just as he had in the Jacksonville incident. Using hand gestures, he repeatedly indicated to the audience that the censorious camera was on him, even holding his arms out and binding his wrists together, suggesting that he had been handcuffed. At one point, he announced to the crowd, "You should have been here last night." But there was plenty to captivate on October 29th, too, at least for one young girl, 11-year-old Sherilyn Sarkeesian, who grew up to be a singer herself. Like Elvis, she would be famous for just one name, Cher. The child had already seen Elvis on The Ed Sullivan Show, and it was as if a thunderbolt had hit her. I was a goner. I loved the way he sang and the way he looked. In some strange way, I felt he expressed who I was. It was weird for an 11-year-old girl to feel that way, she thought. She was a tomboy, but a girly girl, too, though definitely more of a tomboy in a lot of ways. She liked to sing, but she had a really low voice, and she didn't even get into a singing group in her school. Not even a play. She was always in the chorus, but her voice was too high for guys and too low for girls, so she just sang for herself. She didn't seem to neatly fit into any category, and that was part of what she got from watching the gyrating image on TV. Elvis didn't either. When I saw him, I thought, well, this is kind of who I am. Part of it was his bad boy vibe, the way he went against the grain and defied authority, because as a younger child, Cher did too. I got in trouble a lot. Not really big trouble, but when I was 10 or 11, my friend and I ran away from home, took a horse and went out to San Bernardino and hopped a train, just for the adventure of it. I ran away from home once on my tricycle, too. I was always this strange child that wanted more adventure than there was. When she saw Elvis on TV then, I thought, this is perfect. I'm going in the right direction. He just validated where I was going. It helped that her mother, Georgia Holt, a backwoods beauty from Sharp County, Arkansas, not all that far from Memphis, was also into early rock and roll. She thought it was good music, and she wasn't threatened by it. When Sherilyn's friends' mothers saw Elvis, they shrank in revulsion and forbade their children from buying his records. But Georgia watched the Ed Sullivan Show with her daughter, and then when Elvis came to town, she bought tickets for the two of them. Sherilyn was ecstatic, she said in an interview for this book. I was so crazy, I got my hair cut for it, because I hoped he would notice it. I was in such heaven, I almost didn't walk on the ground. Inside the auditorium, she saw him in the gold suit that Nudie, her mom's friend, made. He's really shiny, she thought. Then all of a sudden, all the girls were on their chairs screaming. I didn't understand why exactly. I wasn't completely sure about the sexual part of it, but I was just fascinated with it. I remember saying, Mom, can we stand on our chairs and scream too? And so we did. My mom was yelling and laughing, and I projected myself up there. It didn't make much difference what sex he was. Sherilyn had seen Dumbo as a little kid, and sitting in the dark, watching the big screen, she was so transfixed that she'd peed her pants rather than get up and miss anything. The die had been cast for her future that day, but when she saw Elvis, it was cemented in stone. The Pan-Pacific shows, among the greatest Elvis ever played, were meant to be the last of the tour, until promoter Lee Gordon convinced the Colonel to let him book 2 Hawaiian dates in November, just as Jailhouse Rock opened in theaters. Those concerts, in Honolulu and at Schofield Barracks, Pearl Harbor, would be Elvis's last public performances before entering the military. Every branch of the military service made bids for Elvis to join their ranks, offering perks of one kind or another. Elvis and the Colonel decided on the Army, which offered a 2-year enlistment with a 120-day deferment so he could complete his new movie, Paramount's King Creole. He'd begin shooting it in January with Hungarian director Michael Curtiz, most famous for Casablanca. On December 20th, 1957, he went down to the Memphis draft board to pick up the dreaded notice in person. The Colonel told him to do it, saying it made him look more patriotic, and that mothers and fathers all across the nation would respect him for it. It was good publicity. When reporters asked how he liked trading his blue suede shoes for army boots, he bit his tongue and followed the drill. It's a duty I've got to fill, and I'm going to do it, he said. In private, it was a different story, according to Barbara Pittman, who Elvis had planned on taking on the road with him. Elvis cried in my lap because he had to go into the service. Parker had said, Look, son, you play the hero. If you start battling it and trying to get out of it to support your mother, it's going to make you look bad. Just be the all-American kid type. Milton Bowers, the draft board chairman, had sent him informal word that his induction notice had been drawn up and was waiting for him. Anita remembers the day. His parents were devastated. They could not believe that he was going to have to leave them. He didn't mind going and serving, but he really didn't want to leave his family, and his mother was so worried about what would happen to him. She did not see another happy day after they received that notice. The newspaper came out and took pictures. Elvis held his draft notice up in one, while the others captured the splendor of Graceland and the white nylon Christmas tree festooned with red ornaments. Cliff and Elvis then posed for the huge pile of presents, but neither could resist some attitude. Cliff holding a cigarette, and Elvis, wearing gloves indoors, offering a half sneer. Otherwise, he pretended everything was fine. Elvis bought his mother a mink coat, his father a diamond ring, and the Colonel a snazzy Isetta sports car. Even Billy and Bobby got $100 bills. That whole Christmas was like a kid's dream, Billy remembers. A couple of Christmases before, the Smith children had gone to the Goodfellows dinner for underprivileged kids. Now Aunt Gladys had all kinds of good things to eat for the holidays, and the house was decorated with holly and berries. It was a fun time, Anita confirms, and Gladys made herself get in the spirit for her first Christmas at Graceland. She would look at Elvis and grit her teeth and talk this baby talk, and he would do it back to her. They were gritting their teeth at each other. By the time next Christmas rolled around, Gladys told Elvis she hoped he and Anita would be married with a blonde-headed baby on the way. They talked about it, Anita says. If it were a girl, they'd call her Elisa Marie. But Gladys wanted a boy, Elvis Jr. She said, I can just see him running up and down the driveway in his little bare feet. She was trying to plan Elvis's future, not having any idea of things that were going down. At 23, the most famous man in the world was in no hurry to marry, especially since his military service was upon him. The younger Elvis proposed marriage quickly and often, but he was now past such impetuous actions. Lamar understood the changes. As kids, we were taught that you grow up, get married, and smoke cigarettes. That's just what you did. But he really didn't want to get married, because we'd go on the coast, and he'd get loose and chase everything that was moving. In early 1958, Anita went with Elvis to New Orleans for location shooting on King Creole, his fourth and best film. But she stayed back at the hotel on Parker's orders, as she did in Los Angeles. Anita ensconced at the Knickerbocker, and Elvis at the Beverly Wilshire. On the set, he took a shine to 17-year-old June Wilkinson, who had just come over from England at the invitation of Hugh Hefner and Playboy magazine. Hef dubbed her the Bosom. The amply endowed cheesecake model, 43, 22, 37, had been trained as a ballerina, but began her career as a topless dancer at age 15, joining London's Windmill Theatre as a fan dancer in 1957. June would later gain fame as a platinum-haired vixen in the mode of Jane Mansfield. But at the time Elvis met her, she was a stunning brunette and merely a young friend of the choreographer on the picture. Elvis came over and started talking to me, June recalls of their meeting, and he said, "Would you like to have dinner?" A 17-year-old girl, of course I would like to have dinner. He sent a car to bring her to his hotel, and then in his usual approach, he offered to show her the luxurious suite. When they got to his bedroom, he started kissing me, which was okay with me, and then he wanted to make love. But June was a virgin and intended to stay that way. She thought Elvis would surely cut the evening short when she told him, but instead he said, "Oh, okay," and sat me on his bed, got out his guitar, and sang to me for a couple of hours. I was so impressed. He knew he wasn't going to get any place with me, and it didn't matter. Even Sophia Loren flipped for him during a chance meeting on the Paramount lot while filming Desire Under the Elms. A studio photographer captured the meeting of the two international sex symbols, her arms around his neck, flirty smiles all around. King Creole, based on Harold Robinson's gritty novel A Stone for Danny Fisher, offered Elvis a magnificent role as a young singer navigating the mob-controlled New Orleans club scene. His work reflects his close study of Brando and Dean, and finds him worthy of leading a first-rate cast, including Walter Matthau as Maxie the crime boss, and Carolyn Jones, Maxie's jaded mistress, who also has a soft spot for Danny. Elvis's scenes with the exotic Jones proved powerful and poignant. He was always asking a lot of questions, she remembered. God, he was young. He was always talking about his folks and the house he'd just bought them. But he took more pleasure in reuniting with Dolores Hart as the straight arrow dime store clerk Nellie. Again, Elvis showed interest in her. He nicknamed her Whistlebritches. And again, Dolores demurred. She played with his pompadour on the set, but she might as well have been his sister. Elvis didn't push himself on her because it wasn't right to do so. It was the same with their characters' relationship, too. He understood this so innately that in a rare display of assertiveness, he challenged director Curtiz about a scene in which Danny tricks Nellie into going to a hotel. Still shots remain in which the two sit together on the bed, with Nellie about to unfasten her dress. As the actress remembers, the scene wasn't effective. It was Elvis who finally called a halt to it. He said, "I just don't see how Nellie would even come this far. She wouldn't have me take her dress down and then say no." I agreed with him. After King Creole wrapped in March 1958, Dolores never saw Elvis again, though he wrote her postcards from his military service in Germany, asking, "What's doing, hot lips?" It was a private joke since they'd been forced to do one of their kissing scenes in 104-degree temperature. Elvis was like a young animal, she told a British reporter. He doesn't have much refinement, but this is part of his charm. Still, stories swirled that she left show business and became a nun because she was pregnant with his child. Today, Mother Dolores is, indeed, a Benedictine nun at the Convent of Regina Laudis in Bethlehem, Connecticut, but she didn't enter the order until 1963, 5 years after making King Creole. Philip Stanek, an entertainer who calls himself Elvis Presley Jr., born December 24, 1961 in Gary, Indiana, initially said he believed that he was the actor's illegitimate son. Now, however, he claims his birth mother was the late actress Angelique Pettyjohn, an extra in Elvis's 1961 film Blue Hawaii. Elvis was always a business associate and not a close friend, Dolores insisted. Yet she spent enough time around him to make some observations. In 1959, a movie magazine quoted her as saying, "Elvis is a young man with an enormous capacity of love, but I don't think he has found his happiness. I think he is terribly lonely." In 2003, she spoke of her most abiding memory of him, which occurred during the making of Loving You. They were out in the country, and they'd finished filming for the day. There were some horses around, and we were just laughing and enjoying being out there. He was standing by a rail, and he had his arms reaching out each side of it. He put his head back. He was looking up to the sky, and he was so beautiful and real. And for a moment, he just looked so peaceful. Elvis had finally found some footing in a world he himself had turned upside down. Now the army was about to separate him from everything that mattered: his fame, his career, and most of all, his deathly ill mother. 15. Private Presley. On January 1st, 1958, Jimmy Rogers Snow, who had been Elvis's roommate on some of the early tours, arrived at Graceland for an extended visit. Elvis had run into Hank's son backstage at the Grand Ole Opry 11 days earlier, when he'd gone to Nashville to deliver the Colonel's Izetta sports car. Elvis invited him over to take part in his last big hurrah, a man-child marathon of roller rink bashing, motorcycle riding, and all-night movies, before leaving to make King Creole and then going off to the service. They'd had a long talk one night. Jimmy laughed about opening for Elvis in Texas in 1955, saying how the Memphis Flash came out in a chartreuse jacket and black pants with a white stripe down the side, and the kids were just going wild. And he remembered how cool he was in my mind. I wanted to sing like him. I wanted to dress like him, and do things that I never cared about till I met him. Elvis was studying his script for King Creole and tossed it to Jimmy. "Hey, man, why don't you just go out to California with me? I'll get you a bit part in the picture." But Jimmy declined. I told him how much it meant for me to be there, but I said, "I'm getting married in March, and I'm going into the ministry. Elvis thought that was great. As a matter of fact, he was probably the only one who commended me for it. Everyone else thought I was crazy. 2 months earlier, Jimmy realized he'd been living a perpetual dark night of the soul. He'd been drinking and doing pills since his days on the road. I was just a miserable, unhappy man, but the call of God was on my life. I had sensed it for years, but I didn't know what it was. Just prior to going over to Graceland, Jimmy had turned his life over to Jesus. I quit drinking and pills cold turkey. I was changing my life. Jimmy thanked Elvis for his offer of a part in the movie, but the only way he knew to break with the entertainment business was just to cut all ties. When Jimmy left Graceland in early 1958, his heart was heavy for 2 reasons. He feared for Elvis's soul, for the way he was conducting his personal life, and he worried about Gladys. My memory of his mother is coming downstairs and seeing her sitting in the kitchen drinking beer, always in the same chair. I don't know if she was a lush, but I would see it all the time. Alan Fortas was also concerned about Gladys. She hardly ever left the house, and Alan didn't know what she did with her time. Elvis talked about what a great cook she was, but since they got Alberta, Elvis called her VO5, Alan had never seen Gladys fix a meal. In 1954, when Elvis made his first records, he'd walked into Harry Levitch's jewelry store and bought his mother an electric mixer for Christmas. A few days later, he came back and bought another one, also for Gladys. When Harry asked why, Elvis said he wanted one for each end of the kitchen, so she wouldn't have to walk so much. Now, as both Jimmy and Alan noted, she hardly ever got out of the chair. I just remember passing through the kitchen on my way out to the pool or into the den, and she'd always be there. "Hello, Ms. Presley, how you doing?" "Fine, Alan." She was a nice, simple woman who never pretended to be more than she was in Alan's view. She dipped her snuff, she watched TV in her room, and she worried about her boy. That was her life. She sat by the window in the kitchen, daydreaming or looking out in the backyard. Sometimes she sat out front, away from the fans, sequestered from the neighbors who had tormented her on Audubon Drive. Other times, Vernon would take her for a drive in her pink Cadillac, since she'd never learned to drive. That summer, he would carry her down to Tupelo to see Annie Presley. "We was sittin' there talkin'," Annie remembered, and she said, "Annie, I'd give the world if I lived next door where I could just get out and feed my chickens and do things. But Elvis won't let me do nothin'. You know me, I want to do." She killed her pain with a multitude of beer bottles she hid in the refrigerator behind the milk and the Pepsis, and she sipped on them all day long from a brown paper sack, washing down diet pills, Dexedrine, or other forms of amphetamine, that the doctor gave her. She wanted so to lose weight, to shine in the pictures the magazines took of her family. Normally, she wouldn't drink in front of others, Billy Smith says. She'd stay in her room. The biggest majority of the time, she would go without it, but it seemed like when she got worried, she clung to that real quick. Elvis had known about her medication for a long time, because as Lamar remembers, he pilfered her speed to stay awake on the long drives on tour, even though it made him more hyper than usual. But he had been mystified by her wrenching mood swings. She would be bubbly one minute and at the ends of despair the next. She seemed to be weepy all the time, and pale and withdrawn. She almost never came out of her robe anymore, and she walked so slowly. Somebody put it to early menopause because she'd be hot one minute and cold the next. But the dark circles under her eyes, the color of old blood, were getting so deep they threatened to one day swallow her up. She was almost 46 years old now, but everything about her seemed so much older. Why did she look so unnaturally bloated, as if she might burst if pricked with a pin? Elvis asked about it, but Gladys didn't want him to find out how sick she was, said she didn't know just exactly what her tests had shown. Their bond was so strong that when the wheel bearing went out on his Cadillac that time in Arkansas and caught fire, she bolted upright in her sleep and screamed, "Elvis!" But he was so busy now, so preoccupied with getting things ready for the army, that he wasn't in tune with her the way he had been. That, too, was a source of grief. She was losing him. First it was Jesse, and now Elvis. The first weeks of basic training, they wouldn't even let her come see him. And then they were sending him overseas, to Germany, enemy territory. Elvis had already said he'd take his family with him, but she couldn't imagine such a thing. She told Lamar, "I can't see myself away from Sonny Boy that long, but I just can't go with him." How would she cope without her baby? How would she live? The night before his induction, Elvis, Anita, and the gang went to the drive-in movie to see Sing Boy Sing, starring Colonel Parker's one-time protege, Tommy Sands. The picture was an adaptation of a television drama, The Singing Idol, loosely based on Elvis's own story. Everybody got a kick out of it, especially since Nick Adams played Elvis's buddy, standing in for the whole inner circle. Afterward, the group went to the roller rink one last time and played Crack the Whip, Elvis handing out happy pills he got from the dentist to ease everyone's pain. That night, Alan pulled sleepwalking duty and stayed in his room. But Elvis was too keyed up for sleep, worrying what the next 2 years would bring, so they just stayed up all night and talked. At 6:30 a.m. on March 24th, 1958, the 23-year-old recruit, modeling black trousers, pink and black socks, and a blue striped shirt under a gray and white checked sport coat, reported to the Memphis Draft Board in the M&M building at 198 South Main Street. There, he and 12 others would be inducted into the U.S. Army, and Elvis would be assigned Army serial number 53310-761. With him were his parents, Anita, Lamar, Alan, and Judy Spreckles, who had taken over some of his National Fan Club duties. His double first cousin, the teenaged Patsy Presley, showed up, along with a smattering of fans and quasi-romantic interests, including an attractive blonde named Bonnie Mosby Underwood, the wife of songwriter and future Sun Records engineer Charles Underwood, and the girl some people thought secretly owned Elvis's heart. He carried a small leather bag containing exactly what the induction notice said to bring: a razor, a toothbrush, a comb, and enough money to last for 2 weeks. Among the officers there that day was Walter Alden, whose 1-year-old daughter, Ginger, would grow up to have her own unique place in Elvis history. At Kennedy Veterans Hospital, the most famous man in America was reduced to being just another U.S. male, undergoing processing, enduring the rigors of a physical, and weighing in 185 pounds. Photographers caught him with the rest of the recruits, stripped down to his underwear. Later that afternoon, he raised his right hand before Major Albert Turner and swore the words that made him a soldier. "Congratulations," Major Turner told the group. "You are all privates. That's the way you'll be addressed from now on." Private Presley was put in charge of the unit. As Colonel Parker worked the room, cheerfully handing out balloons stamped King Creole, Elvis hugged and kissed his mother. Her big face was puffy and her brown eyes swollen with tears. They hung on each other until Elvis felt self-conscious, and then he kissed Anita. "Little," he said, "I love you and I will return. And don't forget me." Anita didn't want him to see how upset she was. My heart was being torn away because he was my first love. But they were all crying now. His mother, his father, Anita. It was time for him to board the Army bus for Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. He looked at Lamar and the Cadillac limousine that had brought him there that day, and suddenly it was a symbol of everything he had worked so hard to get. Now it was all about to be gone. It was like a dream. "Goodbye, you long black son of a bitch," he said to the caddy, and everybody laughed. Then he climbed on the bus to begin life anew as Private Presley. 500 screaming girls saw him off. At Fort Chaffee, the new inductees got their shots and then predictably had their hair sheared off. Elvis, whose pompadour once swam with sweat and goose grease, as Time magazine noted, listened to the whirring of the electric clippers and blew the flying fuzz off his hand. "Hair today, gone tomorrow," he said in a studied line, and the news media, 55 photographers and reporters, dutifully wrote it down. By the end of the day, the Army confirmed what he already knew. He would be stationed at Fort Hood, near Killeen, Texas, the largest Army post in the United States, and assigned to the 2nd Armored Division, General Patton's Hell on Wheels outfit. On March 28th, en route to Killeen, the Army transport bus made a stop for lunch at a diner in Hillsboro, Texas. For a full 25 minutes, Elvis blended in with all the other new privates in their fatigues. But a caravan of fans also made the trek to Texas. Suddenly, a young voice squealed, "There's Elvis!" and a small riot broke out. After he left, girls wrestled over his chair. When the bus arrived at Fort Hood about 4:30 in the afternoon, a clench of 30 newsmen stood waiting in summer clothing, holding notebooks to their eyes to shield them from the Texas sun. Private Presley was the second soldier off the bus. Sure, he'd salute for the cameras, he said, flashing his Hollywood smile, and then he held a press conference before going off to his first Army meal of fish and French fries. A dozen teenage girls hovered outside the mess hall. "Let us see him and we'll go away," they cried, but the military police shooed them off. Soon, Elvis's fan mail would number 15,000 letters a week, all of it redirected to the colonel's office in Tennessee. On March 29th, Elvis woke up not to Lamar or Allen at the foot of his bed, but to 6 other men all around him. Some of them wanted their pound of flesh from the millionaire singer, now earning $78 a month. Fellow soldier Rex Mansfield, who was on the bus with Elvis coming out of Memphis, remembered how they teased him. "Where's your hound dog?" and "Aren't y'all lonesome for your teddy bear?" They were all watching him, waiting for him to screw up. But Elvis was determined to fit in. Each arriving recruit received $20 in cash for toothpaste and other basic necessities, and a sergeant immediately seized his moment. "Presley, give me that $20. You don't need it." "Nah, Sergeant, I'm broke." The teasing would stop when they saw he didn't want any special privileges, that he did his KP and guard duty, and marched with a 75-pound pack in the irrepressible heat, eating the Texas dust like everyone else. Elvis was an okay guy, they decided, and who'd have thought that? And Elvis was even more surprised to find out that he liked the Army, the organization, the respect of men, the routine, and predictably, with twinless twins, the uniform, the infinite replication. It served a psychological need. Besides, the fans had no intention of going away. Fort Hood was an open base, meaning soldiers could receive civilian guests when they were off duty, and the girls seemed to know where he was, as if they were sending secret messages to each other, fired by hormones, wrote one reporter. It was true. Jane Levy Christie, then a high school junior, thought it was too gauche to scream and carry on over Elvis, but she and her friends went searching for him anyway. "We found him and took him for a ride to the Dairy Queen, which our boyfriends didn't like very much." Only once did things get problematic. Dorton Matthews, a sergeant, heard a commotion one night around midnight. There were 15 or 20 women in the barracks, giggling and looking for Elvis. The Army couldn't put up with such sorority pranks. We had to have guards after that. But Elvis was not precisely as alone in Killeen as he appeared. Lamar, who had tried to enlist with him, but at 260 pounds flunked the physical, they tried to get me clearance through the Surgeon General, just drove on down in Elvis's Lincoln Mark II and checked into a motel. Elvis was glad to see him, but the truth was that he wanted Gladys. He fell into a deep malaise. As his depression worsened, Master Sergeant William Norwood saw the misery on Elvis's face and took him home to place a phone call. After that, Elvis was a frequent visitor to the Norwood residence, where the sergeant became a confidant, offering hot coffee, home-cooked meals, and fatherly advice. "When you come in my house, you can let it all out," Norwood told him in a rural drawl. "But when you walk out my front door, you are now Elvis Presley. You're an actor. You're a soldier. So by God, I want you to act. Don't let anybody know how you feel on the inside. During basic training, reveille before 5 a.m., sharpshooter practice, crawling over barbed wire, Elvis found another soft shoulder in Eddie Fidel, a theater owner who had been a DJ in Dallas in 1956 when the young singer made the rounds at radio stations. Eddie wasn't in the Army but lived in Waco, 45 minutes away, with his wife, Linnell, daughter Janice, and son Dana. At the base, the Lebanese-American talked his way through security with a picture of himself with the singer. He found Elvis in the day room, shining his boots. Would Elvis like to come out to the house at 2807 Lasker Avenue and visit on weekends? The Fidels were a warm and welcoming family, he said, and Elvis could relax and listen to the latest 45s. Elvis said he had to stay on base for 2 weeks, but then, sure, thanks, he'd be there. He showed up not long after, but the first thing he did after meeting Eddie's family was phone his mother. Eddie remembered the call. When he got her on the line, all he said was, "Mama," and apparently she said Elvis, and from then on, for a whole hour, they were crying and moaning on the telephone. Hardly a word was spoken. Now, Anita started coming down for weekends, though she'd slipped into town before, staying at the Norwood house, Elvis sneaking out of the barracks to be with her. She was surprised at what a regular guy he'd turned into, without his hair dye and the lifts in his shoes. His skin was so beautifully tanned, and for the first time since she'd known him, he was just as normal as anybody else. He would come over, and then we would go in the backyard and look up at the sky. We'd talk about all the things we were planning on doing, like getting married, all the things in the future. And he meant it. Being in the Army had changed his thinking. One time when they drove to Dallas with Eddie, Anita went to the restroom, and Elvis called Eddie over to the car. He put his foot on the bumper and said, "Eddie, when old Lee here gets ready to get married, it's gonna be to that girl, Anita Wood, and no one else. She's the one." He took her to the Fidal's house, where Linnell cooked a pound of bacon for him, burned crisp, like he liked it, and Eddie got him banana and chocolate cream pies from the Tuttle house. In fact, Eddie built a room onto the house just for Elvis, decorating it in pink and black, and outfitting it with a piano and the latest hi-fi equipment. There wasn't anything Eddie wouldn't get for Elvis, and that included prescription drugs, both uppers and downers. "My father knew all the doctors in town," says Janice. "It was easy to get a prescription filled. He'd say, 'Elvis needs to sleep.'" If Elvis's relationship with the older man seemed vaguely odd and unhealthy, no one said anything about it at the time. Everybody just concentrated on having fun. In May, Anita celebrated her 20th birthday, and the Fidels got a cake for her. Elvis, too, made a special effort, slow dancing with Anita in a circle, and softly singing, "Happy, happy birthday, baby." Eddie turned on the tape recorder, and Elvis and Anita sat for their first home recordings, Elvis playing piano, and the two of them singing Hank Williams's "I Can't Help It If I'm Still in Love with You." Anita, who had her professional recording debut coming up in June, was nervous about her first record. "I wish they'd let me pick it," Elvis is heard saying on the tapes. He worried that Anita's producers would try to turn her into Julie London. "They gotta give her something like Connie Francis's songs, something with some guts to it." Looking back, "It was the greatest time that I ever spent with him," Anita says. "He was a soldier boy, and I was his girlfriend from back home, and we were in love, and we were together with friends. We just had a wonderful time." On May 31st, Elvis got a 2-week leave before his next phase of training, a concentration in tank warfare. After a week in Memphis, where he had an oddly somber family portrait made with his parents, he drove to Nashville for an all-night recording session at RCA's Studio B. On the surface, nothing seemed right. He was wearing his uniform. Simple, I'm kinda proud of it. And it was his first session without Scotty and Bill, who had quit in a money dispute, leaving only DJ and the Jordanaires from the old lineup. But musically, Elvis was in fine form. By the time they wrapped things up, he had several hits in the can. "I Need Your Love Tonight," "A Big Hunk of Love," to keep him on the charts while he was away. It would be his last recording session for almost 2 years. When Elvis returned to Fort Hood, he applied for permission to live off base with his family. All soldiers who completed basic training could request permission to live with their dependents, though for most soldiers that meant wife and children. On June 20th, he worked a deal with Stylemaster Mobile Homes for use of a 3-bedroom trailer in exchange for photographs of himself and his parents and grandmother in the unit. They parked it near Fort Hood, and that weekend, Elvis, Vernon, Gladys, Minnie Mae, and Lamar moved in. And when Anita came down on weekends, flying in from New York where she was doing a summer television series with singer Andy Williams, she'd stay there too. At first, Gladys was elated, even in a trailer. She was taking care of her son again, and they were together. But then it got so cramped, and the air conditioning didn't work right, and the toilet stopped up, and Gladys couldn't get any rest, fans knocking on the door night and day. Her mood soured, Anita remembered. Even the scrub trees bothered her. It was in the hot summertime and in the middle of a field way back in the woods, because that's where you had to be if you wanted any privacy at all. It was a difficult time. On July 1st, Vernon moved them all to a large 3-bedroom brick ranch on Colleen's elite Oak Hill Drive, paying the owner, Judge Chester Crawford, an exorbitant $1,400 for 2 months. Elvis obligingly stood outside in the big yard and signed autographs, and everybody was happy again. They all went to the Fidels for the 4th of July, where Gladys ate hamburgers and talked with Linnell, and soon Jean and Junior came down. Elvis had everything he needed now. Minnie Mae fixed his beloved purple hull, peas and sauerkraut and wieners, and he'd hug and kiss on the skinny old firecracker of a woman, Minnie slapping the devil out of him when he'd play tricks on her. On the base, he was doing well in his 10 weeks of advanced tank training. He liked the 60-ton M48 Patton tanks, liked being in Patton's division, liked being a gunner, liked it all. He was a good soldier, winning sharpshooting medals and placing 3rd in tank gunnery, even as the big shells damaged his hearing. When Sergeant Matthews put Elvis in command of a tank, the other soldiers begged for someone else. "He's working us to death," they griped. Anita thought he had finally found himself, and Rex Mansfield wondered the same. "He loved the Army," said Rex. "It was a way to express himself and find out who he really was." But the last happy chapter of his life was coming to an end. Suddenly, Gladys's health began to spiral. She lost her appetite, and she seemed so listless in the Texas heat, found it hard to breathe. Lamar saw what was happening. "One day I looked at her, and she had a yellow tinge to her eyes. I went to Elvis and I said, 'You need to call a doctor. Something's wrong, and I mean it.' But he didn't want to hear about it." Her liver was giving out. Gladys was jaundiced, suffering from acute hepatitis. Within days, her skin took on an ochre hue. Lamar again pleaded with Elvis. They fought about it. "If you don't let her go to the hospital, buddy, she's going to die right here on you." But Elvis didn't want it to be true, insisting she'd get better. Then Red came down, and the two of them forced Elvis to act. A local doctor came to the house and recommended that Gladys return immediately to her own physician, Dr. Charles Clark, in Memphis. On Friday, August 8th, Elvis drove his parents to Temple, Texas, and put them on the train. "She didn't want to go," Lamar says. "She knew she was dying."